Hi, I'm Professor Green, and let's go ahead and talk about Chapter 14, Exporting, Importing, and Counter Trade. Right, I love this tagline, right? Because learning changes everything, um, especially in this chapter, right? That importing and exporting sounds like a really cool idea. It can be so beneficial for businesses. It can also be very complicated. I remember when I went to business school, I had so many friends and colleagues that had spent a couple of years working in import and export. I really didn't really understand why were their jobs so complicated, right? Why had they, dedicated years of their lives to helping businesses get products abroad? And after reading this chapter, it makes a lot more sense. So what we're going to be doing here is explaining the promises and risks associated with exporting, right? So as I said, a lot of opportunity, but things that need to be aware of. We're going to identify the steps managers can take to improve their firm's export performance. So again, to reduce those risks, to make sure that you're working with all the knowledge possible. Recognize the basic steps involving export financing, right? And so there's a whole world of banks and people that are involved in helping you get the financing that you might need to start an import-export business. Identify information sources and government programs that exist to help exporters. We'll see that the US actually is a little bit lacking in those types of things. They have things, but there are amazing initiatives by other countries that are out there, like Japan or even Australia. We'll describe how counter trade can then be used to facilitate exports, right? Which almost is like bartering, but actually is more popular these days than one would expect. So the opening case talks about the Maine Coast Company, and I like this one because it is a small business, or initially it was a small business. They still do 43 million in revenues, growing quickly, and it really helps us identify and visualize, illustrate how import-export works. So they set up a business where they're exporting lobsters to China, live lobsters. So they had to be there within 48 hours to keep them alive. Their foreign sales, as we see here, accounted for 55% of the revenues, right? Because lobster and fresh seafood is such a big thing in Asia. And they just have, so many people. So a great opportunity for this Maine company from Maine to do this. But it had its distribution challenges, right? Because it needed to get the items there very quickly. Then in 2017, Canada signed a trade agreement with the EU. And so that now shifted things, that there are new US tariffs caused by the Chinese response with retaliation tariffs. Again, going back to President Trump, right? How he changed our relationship a little bit with China, and he was putting now tariffs on their products coming into the US. So then China came back and said, okay, we're going to put tariffs on US products coming into China. And so now it was a huge price advantage for Canadian lobsters now to be working with China. And so the revenue from the Maine, which is the United States, right, the revenue drops from their export business. So it then changed its strategy to survive. So then they started to import and export mostly to Europe. And yeah, definitely a new thing. And they had to pivot and they had to change, and they seem to be continuing to do well. But as you can see, what we think of small adjustments in tariffs or subsidies, et cetera, can make a big difference for these small businesses. Let's go ahead and get into it, talking more about what the Maine Lobster Company does every day. So there can be a huge promise of exporting. Both large and small firms can benefit, right? That it's not just large firms that will do this. It's increasing as exporting now has become easier with the internet and translation services, things like this. There are more regional economic agreements, obviously even bigger than that, right? As we see between Canada, the US, and Mexico, there's a lot of free trade going on. But there's also a decline in trade barriers, right, because of the WTO, as we've discussed in this course. And that, the WTO is really helping to break down those barriers. And the last one, right, modern communication and transportation technologies have alleviated the logistical problems. And so that So it's making things easier, but right, exporting still remains a challenge for many firms. At the same time, right, they're losing out on opportunities if they don't export. Talking to the next one. So what are some of the promises and pitfalls of exporting? Um, so we're going to look here as for some of the promises, right? The big one that I see as a proponent of international business, that the international market is usually much bigger than the domestic market, right? Even if you're in Maine and the US market is huge, but the China market, right, for lobsters is bigger, right? Europe is really great when it comes to these types of things. So, right, so you want to export if you can. Larger firms may be proactive in seeking out the new opportunities, but smaller firms sometimes take this reactive approach. They just don't have the know-how necessarily. They might be unfamiliar, they might be intimidated. Why exporters account for a tiny percentage of US firms, actually. That's again why I'm so passionate about teaching international business, because it opens people up to these opportunities that they might not have known about before. There are many novice exporters that have had significant problems when trying to do for business abroad, as we've seen, right? Mergers and acquisitions, people really underestimate how much time and effort it can take to do work abroad. So what are some common pitfalls for the exporters? First, a poor market analysis, right? That's why you should hire a consultant potentially. Maybe someone from Thunderbird who specialized in this, like my good friend, Catherine, as I mentioned a minute, she worked for the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. So she was hired by the government, it's also known as Austrade, hired by the Australian government to help Australian companies export products into the United States, because she worked in Washington, D.C., and then also help market those products when they got to the US, and then also help FDI back to Australia. So she was a pro when it came to market analysis. Another pitfall is some poor understanding of the competitive conditions, right? Really understanding what it looks like when you get your product there. Failure to customize the product offering, as we've said, right? Starbucks always hires someone locally. They have a joint venture initially to really understand what the coffee preferences are in that area of the world. They might lack an effective distribution program, which we'll talk about more in this chapter, right? What does it mean to actually logistically ship a product abroad? There might be a poorly executed promotional campaign. Again, that is, dependent a lot on the culture. You want to make sure that you have good marketing involved. Problem securing finances, again, because people don't necessarily know the companies on either side of the water. And then either side of the border, banks don't know those companies. And then there's also voluminous paperwork, complex formalities, and potential delays and errors. Not that I ever exported my dog, but I would travel with her to Europe very often. She's been to the Czech Republic. She passed last year, but she had been to the Czech Republic 3 times in her lifetime. And every time I went with her, I had to fill out all this paperwork, first from her vet, then I had to go to the United States organization for food and drugs and get their information. And then sometimes there would be errors and I'd have to go back. And then after a couple of weeks, I'd finally get the stamp of approval that we could go. And the hard part was that I needed to get that stamp of approval within like 2 or 3 days of our flight. So it always it was a little bit stressful. And so that's my personal experience with not necessarily exporting, but being able to take a dog or a pet abroad. Let's go ahead and talk about international comparisons that, right, as I said earlier, the United States doesn't do all that great when it comes to supporting businesses in the US to export, but other countries do great for their products. Many firms fail to consider export opportunities simply because they lack the knowledge and opportunities abroad. I definitely feel that way growing up here in the United States. It wasn't very normal for neighbors or people that I knew to say, okay, I'm going to start shipping my handbags, whatever it was, to a different country. But when I moved to Germany, that was very different. Germany and Japan, for example, have extensive institutional structures for promoting imports, probably because they You know, this has been going on for decades. The US is such a big market. So they felt it worthwhile to then take advantage of those other markets. The Japanese one is called the Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry. Japanese exporters can take advantage of the knowledge and contacts of what's called the Sogo Shasha, Japan's trading houses. They have offices around the world that will help you. As I mentioned also, right, Austrade also has offices around the world, the biggest one in the United States being in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, I think the U.S. does not have an institutional structure for promoting exports. And it does get complicated, right? Because from a United Nations trade report, it says that a typical transaction can include 30 parties, as we'll see in a couple of slides where those 30 parties are, 60 documents, and 360 copies. And time and costs can amount to 10% of the final value of goods. And as I mentioned, my dog had been to not only the Czech Republic 3 times, but to Ecuador once, and she'd also been to Switzerland and all over Europe, but our point of entry was the Czech Republic. But in any case, I understand that process because exactly tons of copies, tons of paperwork, lots of opportunity for error. So let's hop into the next slide. How can we improve our export performance in the United States? So there are some informational sources. The Department of Commerce is probably the most comprehensive source of information. The U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service and International Trade Administration. Folks can get like a best prospects list of potential foreign distributors. When I did my yoga DVDs, I was a U.S. entrepreneur, but it was really up to me to go out. I went to different foreign markets. I went to Cannes, you know, where the big film festival is in the south of France, because DVDs, even yoga DVDs, fall under the umbrella of film. And that's where I was able to meet my distributors. But it was really me taking the initiative, taking the cost and time to go do that. Harder to do that from the US. Trade events and assistance can come from the SBA, the Small Business Administration, which is growing, which is really nice to see since Obama was in office. That has really taken on a lot more responsibility. There's some state and local trade, local commissions, and private organizations such as commercial banks or major accounting firms actually can be quite helpful. There's also, here at LMU, we work with an organization called CYBER. It's a Center of International Business, Education, and Research. There are 15 centers around the United States, and these help assist in exporting needs to increase the competitiveness of the United States, and promoting education is one of those things. So CIBER is what it's called, cyber. Now I think they took off the R, but we still call it cyber, CIBE. Okay, let's go ahead and hop into the service providers. We're going to go through this long list, and I'll create the definition here for you. And then, so first we have a freight forwarder. They combine smaller shipments into one single large shipment to go abroad. Again, when I graduated Thunderbird, I had a lot of friends intern with DHL. Actually, it was a very prestigious internship to get in Frankfurt in Germany, because they become an amazing freight forwarder. Then we have an export management company that handles all the aspects of exporting. Gosh, I wish I had that. I had someone to help me with that with my dog. I don't think they exist, but that would have been very helpful as opposed to me finding out all the details that I needed to do. They're like an export marketing company as well that handle all the different details. Then we have an export trading company. This is the person that actually exports the product and sends it abroad. We have an export packaging company, right? What you think, like, what's the big deal? Can I just put it in an envelope in a box? Not necessarily, right? That each country, each product has different rules on how you can package an item. And so there are services out there for companies that are unfamiliar with exporting and making sure that they're putting that and packaging that correctly. We have customs brokers. Again, these are people who help you avoid the pitfalls because, again, each country has different rules on customs and what you have to pay and what's allowed into the country, what's not allowed into the country, etc. So super helpful to understand all of those nuances. I always think it's interesting when I send something abroad to my family or friends in Switzerland or the Czech Republic, right? I always have to write on the package the value of what it is. And so, and very often if I send like a new book or a new piece of clothing, I will often take off the tags because a lot of times they have customs rules. If you're importing or exporting something new, then there's going to be a charge for that. If it's used, then there's less of a charge for that. Once I was living in Germany and I received, a friend of mine sent me a package and like ordered it from a catalog, like Land's End, and sent it to me in Germany. And they showed up and with the package and they said, "Can I have $75?" And I was like, "What? It's a present." And they said, "No, because it's a new thing, you have to pay an import tax." Then we have confirming houses. These are called buying agents. They represent foreign companies that that want to buy products. So that's pretty cool, right? So they'll come to you potentially and say, "We'd like to buy your products and import it into our country." Then we have export agents, merchants, and remarketers. So kind of an offshoot of that. I think of these as like the white labelers. So when I go to Costa Mesa and Irvine, there's a huge nutrition show where they sell vitamins, and there are so often people there that are looking for vitamin D, vitamin E, etc. And then they just want to put their own label on it so they'll sell it to them without your name on it. There's also piggyback marketing. One firm distributes another's product. So if they're selling to the same customer, there might be other products that they might be interested in. And then the last thing is economic processing zones, EPZs. These are places to receive shipments and then reship smaller amounts. I live near LAX, and whenever I drive home and pick up my son from school in Manhattan Beach, we pass by like a block or two off of LAX. There are all these places for trucks to come in and out to pick up goods, drop off goods, etc. I see all the DHL planes, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're receiving shipments, breaking them apart, and putting them in different directions. Okay, as I started this chapter, I thought I don't know so much about import export, but actually maybe I know more than I do. Export strategy. This is with a export management company to help identify opportunities and navigate the paperwork. As I said, this is a great way. The title of the slide, right, is improving your export performance. And right, just because even though I know a good amount about export import, I definitely don't feel like a pro. And I think it's really important to hire a pro in these situations. Start by focusing initially on just one or two markets so it doesn't get very confusing, get simpler, more simple. You enter a foreign market on a small scale, just ship a couple of products, see how that goes. And recognize the time and managerial commitment involved. When we took my yoga DVDs to Germany, we did start on a small scale. Honestly, I'm not gonna lie, it never really took off for the actual DVDs, but you can see my DVD content every day on a sports channel all over Europe, Eastern Europe, including Body and Balance. So we did it digitally as opposed to an actual hard copy DVD, which is a lot more complicated. You want to devote a lot of attention to building strong and enduring relationships with local distributors or customers. You want to hire local personnel, right? I hired somebody in the EU to help me with that. Or what was the EU? They were British, but this was about 10 years ago. We're going to be proactive about seeking export opportunities. So they don't just come to you, right? You need to really go out. As I said, I took my DVDs to the south of France when I was looking for people to represent my product. And then you want to retain the option of local production as well. So, and that's what I did. I produced DVDs in the US, but then I also produced DVDs in the UK as well. Let's go ahead and do one last slide. Talking about the Global Edge exporting tool from the University of Michigan, which you think, is maybe just an academic tool, but actually it's not. They have 2 million active users. It's a free site for international business resources, company readiness to export tool. So it identifies strengths and weaknesses and letting the company know if they're potentially ready to start an import-export business. It assesses the company's readiness to export and assesses the product's readiness to be exported. So a great thing to try out. Good. I'm going to go ahead and stop with the first video of this chapter, and I'll see you in chapter.